Where we left off, what were the children about to cook? Dante?
Yeah, they were about to cook
Hands down.
some olives,
Capers?
capers, avocado, garlic, tomatoes, and all together in a pot. The spaghetti.
Yep, they were making a spaghetti dinner for who? Who were they cooking for, Giada? Count Olaf and his theater troupe. What's another word for troupe? What's another word for troupe?
I remember, but I forgot it.
Oh, it's like it's on your paper. It's like a group or a company, his theater group or company, like a team almost. The Baudelaire orphans copied the recipe from the cookbook onto a piece of scrap paper, and Mrs. Strauss was kind enough to escort them to the market to buy the necessary ingredients. Our iPads are down and flipped unless that's what we're reading on. Count Olaf had not left them very much money, but the children were able to buy everything they needed. From a street vendor, they purchased olives after tasting several varieties and choosing their favorites. A street vendor is like, have you ever been to downtown Dunedin? When they have like their Saturday morning market out?
In Mexico, there's like a lot of them.
Yeah, there are a lot of street vendors in Mexico. Here in Florida, like if a street vendor is somebody who sells food out on the street, not in a restaurant, almost like a food truck. But they sell the ingredients for recipes in
like
some
tents.
situations.
They have, like,
They may have tents or whatever, yeah. At a pasta store, they selected interestingly shaped noodles and asked the woman running the store for the proper amount for 13 people. The 10 people Count Olaf mentioned, and the 3 of them. Gabby, I need your attention here. Then at the supermarket, they purchased garlic, which is a sharp-tasting bulbous plant, anchovies, which are small, salty fish, capers, which are flower buds of a small shrub and taste marvelous, and tomatoes, which are actually fruits, not vegetables, as most people believe. They thought it would be proper to serve dessert, and bought several envelopes of pudding mix. Perhaps the orphans thought if they made a delicious meal, Count Olaf might be kinder to them. Thank you so much for helping us out today, Violet said, as she and her siblings walked home with Justice Strauss. I don't know what we would have done without you. You seem like very intelligent people, Justice Strauss said. I dare say you would have thought of something. But it continues to strike me as odd that Count Olaf has asked you to prepare such an enormous meal. Well, here we are. I must go inside and put my own groceries away. I hope you children will come over soon and borrow books from my library. Tomorrow? Klaus said quickly. Could we come over tomorrow? I don't see why not, Justice Strauss said, smiling. I can't tell you how much we appreciate this, Violet said carefully. With their kind parents dead and Count Olaf treating them so abominably, the 3 children were not used to kindness from adults, and weren't sure if they were expected to do anything back. Tomorrow, before we use your library again, Klaus and I would be more than happy to do household chores for you. Sunny isn't really old enough to work, but I'm sure we could find some way she could help you. Justice Strauss smiled at the 3 children, but her eyes were sad. She reached out a hand and put it in Violet's hair, and Violet felt more comforted than she had been in some time. That won't be necessary, Justice Strauss said. You are always welcome in my home. Then she turned and went into her home, and after a moment of staring after her, the Baudelaire orphans went into theirs. For most of the afternoon, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny cooked the sauce according to the recipe. Violet roasted the garlic and washed and chopped the anchovies. Klaus peeled the tomatoes and pitted the olives. Sunny banged on a pot with a wooden spoon, singing a rather repetitive song she had written herself. And all 3 of the children felt less miserable than they had since their arrival at Count Olaf's. The smell of cooking food is often a common one, and the kitchen grew cozy as the sauce simmered. A culinary term which means cooked over low heat. The 3 orphans spoke of pleasant memories of their parents and about Justice Strauss, who they agreed was a wonderful neighbor, and in whose library they planned to spend a great deal of time. As they talked, they mixed and tasted the chocolate pudding. Just as they were placing the pudding in the refrigerator to cool, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny heard a loud booming sound at the front door, and the front door was flung open. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you who was home. Orphans! Count Olaf called out in his scratchy voice. Where are you, orphans? In the kitchen, Count Olaf called. We're just finishing dinner. You better be, Count Olaf said, and strode into the kitchen. He gazed at all three Baudelaire children with his shiny, shiny eyes. My troop is right behind me, and they are very hungry. Where is the roast beef? We didn't make roast beef, Violet said. We made sauce. What? No roast beef? You didn't tell us you wanted roast beef, Klaus said. Count Olaf slid toward the children so that he looked even taller than he was. His eyes grew even brighter, and in one eyebrow raised in anger. In agreeing to adopt you, he said, I have become your father, and as your father, I am not someone to be trifled with. I demand that you serve roast beef to myself and my guests. We don't have any, Violet cried. We made the sauce. No, 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 Sunny shouted. Count Olaf looked down at Sunny, who had spoken so suddenly. With an inhumane roar, he picked her up in one scraggly hand and raised her so she was staring at him in the eye. Needless to say, Sunny was very frightened and began crying immediately, too scared to even bite the hand that held her. Put her down immediately, you beast, Klaus shouted. He jumped up, trying to rescue Sunny from the grasp of the Count, but he was holding her too high to reach. Count Olaf looked down at Klaus and smiled a terrible toothy grin, raising the wailing Sunny up even higher in the air. He seemed about to drop her on the floor when there was a large burst of laughter in the next room. Olaf! Where's Olaf? Voices called out. Count Olaf paused, still holding the wailing Sunny up in the air, as members of his theater troupe walked into the kitchen. Soon they were crowding the room, an assortment of strange-looking characters of all sizes and shapes. There was a bald man with a very long nose, dressed in a long black robe. There were two women who had on bright powder all over their faces, making them look like ghosts. Behind them all was a man with very long and skinny arms, at the end of which there were two hooks instead of hands. There was a person who was extremely fat, who looked neither like a man nor a woman. And behind this person, standing in the doorway, were an assortment of people the children could not see, but who promised to be just as frightening. Here you are, Olaf, said one of the white-faced women. What in the world are you doing? I'm just disciplining these orphans, Count Olaf said. I asked them to make dinner, and all they have made is some disgusting sauce. You can't go easy on children, the man with the hook hand said. They must be taught to obey their elders. The tall, bald man peered at the youngsters. Are these, he said to Count Olaf, those wealthy children who you were telling me about? Yes, Count Olaf said. They are so awful I can scarcely stand to touch them. With that, he lowered Sunny, who was still wailing on the floor. Violet and Klaus breathed a sigh of relief that he had not dropped her from that great height. I don't blame you, said someone from the doorway. Count Olaf rubbed his hands together as if he had been holding something revolting instead of an infant. Well, enough talk, he said. I suppose we will all eat their dinner, even though it is all wrong. Everyone follow me to the dining room, and I will pour us some wine. Perhaps by the time these brats serve us, we'll be too drunk to care if it's roast beef or not. Hurrah! Cried several members of the troop, and they marched through the kitchen, following Count Olaf into the dining room. Nobody paid a bit of attention to the children, except for the bald man who stopped and stared in Violet's eyes. You're a pretty one, he said, taking her face in his rough hands. If I were you, I would try not to anger Count Olaf, or he might wreck that pretty little face of yours. Violet shuddered, and the bald man gave a high-pitched giggle and left the room. Both of their children, alone in the kitchen, found themselves breathing heavily, as if they had just run a long distance. Sunny continued to wail, and Klaus found that his eyes were wet with tears as well. Only Violet didn't cry, but merely trembled with fear and revulsion. A word here which means an unpleasant mixture of horror and disgust. For several minutes, none of them could speak. This is terrible, terrible, Klaus finally said. Violet, what can we do? I don't know, she said, I'm afraid. Me too, Klaus said. Hucks, Sunny said as she stopped crying. Let's have some dinner, someone shouted from the dining room. And the theater troupe began pounding on the table in a strict rhythm, which is an exceedingly rude thing to do. We'd better serve the dinner. Who knows what Count Olaf will do to us? Violet thought of that bald man had said about wrecking her face and nodded. The two of them looked at the pot of bubbling sauce, which had seemed so cozy while they were making it, and now looked like a vat of blood. Ugh. Then leaving Sunny behind in the kitchen, they walked into the dining room, Klaus carrying a bowl of interestingly shaped noodles, and Violet carrying the sauce in a large ladle in which to serve it. The theater troupe was talking and cackling, drinking again and again from their wine cup and paying no attention to the Baudelaire orphans as they circled the table, serving everyone dinner. Violet's right hand ached from holding the heavy ladle. She thought of switching to her left hand, but because she was right-handed, she was afraid she might spill the sauce on her left hand, which could enrage Count Olaf again. She stared miserably at Count Olaf's plate of food and found herself wishing she had bought poison at the market and put it in the sauce. Finally, they were through serving, and Klaus and Violet slipped back in the kitchen. They listened to the wild, rough laughter of Count Olaf and his theater troupe. They picked at their own portions of food, too miserable to eat. Before long, Olaf's friends were pounding on the table and strict with him again, and the orphans went out to the dining room to clear the table, and then again to serve the chocolate pudding. By now it was obvious that Count Olaf and his associates had drunk a great deal of wine, and they slouched at the table and spoke much less. Finally they roused themselves and trooped back to the kitchen, scarcely glancing at the children on their way out of the house. Count Olaf looked around the room, which was filled with dirty dishes. Because you haven't cleaned up yet, he said to the orphans, I suppose you can be excused from attending tonight's performance. But after cleaning up, you are to go straight to your beds. Klaus had been glaring at the floor, trying to hide how upset he was. But at this, he could not remain silent. You mean our bed, he shouted. You have only provided us with one bed. Members of the theater troupe stopped in their tracks at this outburst and glanced from Klaus to Count Olaf to see what would happen next. Count Olaf raised one eyebrow, and his eyes shone brightly, but he spoke calmly. If you would like another bed, he said, tomorrow you may go to town and purchase one. You know perfectly well we haven't any money, Klaus said. Of course you do, Count Olaf said, and his voice began to get a little louder. You are the inheritors of an enormous fortune. That money, Klaus said, remembering what Mr. Poe said, is not to be used until Violet is of age. Count Olaf's face grew very red. For a moment he said nothing, then in one sudden movement he reached down and struck Klaus across the face. Klaus fell to the floor, his face inches from the eyes tattooed on Olaf's ankle. His glasses leaped from his face and skittered across the corner. His left cheek, where Olaf had struck him, felt as if it were on fire. The theater troupe laughed, and a few of them applauded as if Count Olaf had done something very brave instead of something despicable. Come on, friends, Count Olaf said to his comrades. We'll be late for our own performance. What does comrades mean?
Like friends.
Friends. If I know you, Olaf, you'll figure out a way to get to that Baudelaire money. We'll see, Count Olaf said. But his eyes were shining bright as if he already had an idea. There was another loud boom as the front door shut behind Count Olaf and his terrible friends, and the Baudelaire children were alone in the kitchen. Violet knelt at Klaus' side, giving him a hug to make him feel better. Sonny crawled over to the glasses, picked them up, and brought them to him. Klaus began to sob, not so much from pain, but from rage at the terrible situation they were in. Violet and Sonny cried with him, and they continued weeping as they washed the dishes and they blew out the candles in the dining room, as they changed out of their clothes and lay down to go to sleep. Klaus in the bed, Violet on the floor, Sonny on her little cushion of curtains. The moonlight shone through the window as if anyone had looked into the Baudelaire orphan's bedroom, they would have seen the three children crying quietly all night long. Why do you think, go back to those questions again that we answered the other day, why do you think they asked Mr. Poe about this Count Olaf person? Knowing what we know now, why do you think, Giada?
Like, Mr. Poe said that he was related to that, and that the orphans had never seen him before, and they weren't really sure about him.
Yeah, the orphans never seen him, they weren't sure. Do you think that they were suspicious a little bit?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That is a literary technique. Are you ready? Eyes here for a minute. That's called foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is when an author kind of gives the reader hints about what may be happening, what's coming, something to look towards. So when we read those questions that they were asking, like, how come we've never met this guy? Where is he from again? Why haven't our parents introduced us? That was done on purpose, that you, as the reader, would stop and think, well, wait a minute, what is happening here? Chapter 5. Unless you've been very, very lucky, you have undoubtedly experienced events in your life that have made you cry. So unless you've been very lucky, you know that a good long session of weeping can often make you feel better, even if your circumstances have not changed one bit. Has anybody ever experienced that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where you just cry and then, even if nothing's changed, you kind of feel a little bit better? So it was with the Baudelaire orphans. Having cried all night, they rose the next morning feeling as if a weight had been lifted or off their shoulders. The three children knew, of course, that they were still in a terrible situation, but they thought they might do something to make it better. The morning note from Count Olaf ordered them to chop firewood in the backyard, and as Violet and Klaus swung the axe down over each log to break it into smaller pieces, they discussed the possible plans of action, while Sonny chewed meditatively on a small piece of wood. Clearly, Klaus said, fingering the ugly bruise on his face where Olaf had struck him, we cannot stay here any longer. I would rather take my chances on the street than live in this terrible place. But who knows, bless you, but who knows what misfortunes would befall us on the streets, Violet pointed out. At least here we have a roof over our heads. I wish our parents' money could be used now instead of when you come of age. Klaus said then we could buy a castle and live in it with armed guards patrolling the outside to keep Count Olaf and his troop. And I could have a large inventing studio, Violet said wistfully. She swung the axe down and split a log neatly in two, filled with gears and pulleys and wires and an elaborate computer system. And I could have a large library, Klaus said, as comfortable as Justice Strauss's, but more enormous. Gibbo! Sonny shrieked, which appeared to mean, and I can have lots of things to bite. But in the meantime, Violet said, we have to do something about our predicament. Perhaps Justice Strauss could adopt us, Klaus said. She said we're always welcome in our house. But she meant for a visit, or to use her library, Violet pointed out. She didn't mean to live. Perhaps if we explained our situation to her, she would agree to adopt us, Klaus said hopefully. But when Violet looked at him, she saw that he knew it was of no use. Adoption is an enormous decision, and not likely to happen impulsively. I'm sure in your life you have occasionally wished to be raised by different people than the ones who are raising you, but you knew in your heart the chances of this were very slim. I think we should go see Mr. Poe, Violet said. He told us when he dropped us here that we could contact him at the bank if we have any questions. We don't really have a question, Klaus said. We have a complaint. He was thinking of Mr. Poe walking toward them at Briny Beach with his terrible message, even though the fire was of course not Mr. Poe's fault. Klaus was reluctant to see Mr. Poe because he was afraid of getting more bad news. Can't think of anyone else to contact, Violet said. Mr. Poe is in charge of our affairs, and I'm sure if he knew how horrid Count Olaf is, he would take us right out of here. Klaus pictured Mr. Poe arriving in his car and putting the Baudelaire orphans inside to go somewhere else, and felt a stirring of hope. Anywhere would be better than here. Okay, he said, let's get this firewood all chopped and we'll go to the bank. Invigorated by their plan, the Baudelaire orphans swung their axes at amazing speed, and soon enough they were done chopping firewood and ready to go to the bank. They remembered Count Olaf saying he had a map of the city, and they looked thoroughly for it, but they couldn't find any trace of the map, and decided it must be in the tower, where they were forbidden to go. So without directions of any sort, the Baudelaire children set off for the city's banking district in hope of finding Mr. Poe. After walking through the meat district, the flower district, the sculpture district, the three children arrived at the banking district, pausing to take a refreshing sip of water at the fountain of Victoria's finance. The banking district consisted of several wide streets with large marble buildings on each side of them, all banks. They went first to the trustworthy bank, and then to the faithful savings and loan, and then to the subservient financial services, each time inquiring for Mr. Poe. Finally, a receptionist at Subservient said she knew Mr. Poe worked down the street at Mulberry Money Management. The building was square and rather plain looking. Though once inside, the three orphans were intimidated by the hustle and bustle of the people they raced through the large equity rooms. Finally, they asked the uniformed guard whether they had arrived at the right place to speak to Mr. Poe. And he led them into a large office with many file cabinets and no windows. Why, hello, Mr. Poe said in a puzzled tone of voice, sitting at a desk covered in typed papers that looked important and boring. Surrounded by a small frame photograph of his wife and two beastly sons, were three telephones with flashing lights. Please come in. Thank you, Klaus said, shaking Mr. Poe's hand. The Baudelaire youngster sat down in three large, comfortable chairs. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to speak, but it took off into a handkerchief before he could begin. I'm very busy today, he said finally, so I don't have much time to chat. Next time you should call ahead of time when you plan to be in the neighborhood, and we'll put some time aside to take you to lunch. That would be very pleasant, Violet said, and we're sorry we didn't contact you before we stopped by, but we find ourselves in an urgent situation. Count Olaf is a madman, Klaus said, getting right to the point. We cannot stay with him. He struck Klaus across the face. See this bruise? Violet said, but just as she said it, one of the telephones rang in a loud, unpleasant wail. Excuse me, Mr. Poe said. Poe here, he said to the receiver. What? Yes, 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 no, yes. Thank you. He hung up the phone and looked at the Baudelaires as if he had forgotten that they were even there. I'm sorry, Mr. Poe said. What were we talking about? Oh yes, Count Olaf. I'm sorry you don't have a good first impression of him. He's only provided us with one bed, Klaus said. He makes us do a great many difficult chores. He drinks too much wine. Excuse me, Mr. Poe said as another telephone rang. Poe here, he said. 7, 7, 7, 7, 6.5, 7. You're welcome. Young Evans quickly wrote down something on one of his papers and then looked at the children. I'm sorry, he said. What were you thinking about Count Olaf making you do chores? That doesn't sound too bad. He calls us orphans. He has terrible friends. He's always asking about our money. Poco! That was from Sonny. Mr. Poe put up his hand to indicate he had heard enough. Children, children, he said. You must give yourselves time to adjust to your new home. You've only been there a few days. Been there long enough to know Count Olaf is a bad man, Klaus said. Mr. Poe sighed and looked at each of the three children. His face was kind, but it didn't look like he really believed the Bulldozer orphans were saying. Are you familiar with the Latin term in loco parentis, he asked? Violet and Sunny looked at Klaus, the biggest reader of the three. He was the most likely to know the vocabulary words and foreign phrases. Something about trains, he asked? Maybe Mr. Poe was going to take them by train to another relative. Mr. Poe shook his head. In loco parentis means acting in the role of parent, he said. It's a legal term and it applies to Count Olaf. Now that you are in his care, the Count may raise you using any method he sees fit. I'm sorry if your parents didn't make you do any household chores, or if you never saw them drink any wine, or if you like their friends better than Count Olaf's friends. But these are things that you must get used to as Count Olaf is acting in loco parentis. Understand? But he struck my brother, Violet said. Look at his face. As Violet spoke, Mr. Poe reached into his pocket for a handkerchief and, covering his mouth, coughed many, many times into it. He coughed so loudly that Violet could not be certain he had heard her. Whatever Count Olaf has done, Mr. Poe said, glancing down at his papers and circling a number, he has acted in loco parentis, and there's nothing I can do about it. Your money will be well protected by myself and by the bank, but Count Olaf's parenting techniques are his own business. And I hate to usher you out post haste, but I have very much work to do. The children sat there stunned. Mr. Poe looked up and cleared his throat. Post haste, he said, means you will do nothing to help us, Violet finished for him. She was shaking with anger and frustration. As when the phones began ringing, she stood up and walked out of the room, followed by Klaus, who was carrying Sunny. They stalked out of the bank and stood on the street, not knowing what to do next. What shall we do next? Klaus asked sadly. Violet stared at the sky. She wished she could invent something that would take them out of here. It's getting a bit late, she said. We might as well go back and think of something else tomorrow. Perhaps we can stop and see Justice Strauss. But you said she wouldn't help us, Klaus said. Not for help, but for books. It is very useful, woman is young, to learn the difference between literally and figuratively. If something happens literally, it actually happens. If something happens figuratively, it feels like it's happening. If you are literally jumping for joy, for instance, it means you are leaping in the air because you are very happy. If you are figuratively jumping for joy, it means you are so happy you could jump for joy, but you are saving your energy for other matters. The Boulder-Lair orphans walked back to Count Olaf's neighborhood and stopped at the home of Justice Strauss, who welcomed them inside and let them choose books in the library. Violet chose several about mechanical inventions, Klaus chose several about wolves, and Sunny found a book with many pictures of teeth inside. Then they went to their room and crowded together on the one bed, reading intently and happily. Figuratively, they escaped from Count Olaf and their miserable existence. They did not literally escape, because they were still in the house and vulnerable to Olaf's evil and loco parentis ways. But by immersing themselves in their favorite reading topics, they felt far away from their predicament as if they had escaped. In the situation of the orphans, figuratively escaping was not enough, of course. But at the end of a tiring and hopeless day, it would have to do. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny read their books, and in the back of their minds hoped that their figurative escape would eventually turn into a literal one. Go ahead and cut.